All right, so today we're tackling libertarianism, and we've got quite a bit of material to cover.
Yeah, it looks like we've got a whole stack of excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Definitely not light reading, but, um, our listeners are philosophers at heart.
Absolutely, they love to dive into these dense philosophical topics.
That's right. So let's get right to it. Where should we even begin with something as big as libertarianism?
Well, the best place to start is always the core, right? What's at the very heart of this philosophy. And for libertarians, it's this unwavering commitment to individual freedom.
Individual freedom.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the foundation.
Yeah.
But how far does that go? I mean, does it mean anything goes?
Not exactly. They definitely see coercion, especially by the state, as like the ultimate evil.
Even if it's for the greater good,
Yeah.
to protect people.
Well, even then, they'd argue that as long as you're not harming others, you have the right to make your own choices, even if they're risky.
Hmm. Yeah, that's where it starts to get a little controversial. I can see that.
Definitely. And it gets even more interesting when you think about it in terms of things like economics.
Right, like how does this focus on individual freedom play out when we're talking about economic justice?
Libertarians are generally big fans of free markets, and they see any kind of wealth redistribution as a violation of individual rights.
Wow, so taking from the rich to help the poor, that's a no-go in libertarianism.
Pretty much, they see it as a form of coercion you're taking from someone without their consent, even if it's for a good cause.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this sparks so much debate. It's a pretty radical stance.
Yeah, for sure. It challenges a lot of our assumptions about how society should work.
So is this a totally new idea, or does it have roots in earlier philosophies?
Oh, it definitely has a history. You can trace it back to classical liberalism thinkers like John Locke, David Hume, Adam Smith.
Oh yeah, those are some big names in philosophy and economics.
Exactly. They were all about individual rights, limited, government-free markets. Those core ideas that libertarianism builds on.
Okay, so classical liberalism is like the foundation. But you mentioned something about anarchism too, and that seems like a pretty big leap.
It might seem that way, but there's a strong anarchist thread in libertarianism, especially the individualist anarchist tradition.
Individualist anarchists.
Yeah.
So not the bomb-throwing kind.
No, not at all. We're talking about thinkers like Benjamin Tucker, Lysander Spooner. They were very critical of state power.
So they saw the state as inherently oppressive.
Yeah, they believed that a truly free society could exist without a state relying instead on voluntary cooperation and market mechanisms.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea. I mean, no government at all. How would that even work?
That's a question they grappled with a lot, coming up with models for how things like justice and defense could be handled without a state.
Hmm. Fascinating stuff. But I imagine even within libertarianism, there are different interpretations, right? Not everyone agrees on every detail.
Oh, absolutely. There are lots of internal debates and different schools of thought.
So it's not just a monolithic thing.
No, there's a lot of nuance, and one way to understand those different perspectives is to look at the distinction between left libertarianism and right libertarianism.
Okay, I've heard those terms, but to be honest, they've always confused me a bit. Can you break it down for us? What are the key differences?
Sure, so both left and right libertarians share those core commitments: individual freedom, limited, government-free markets.
Right, those are the non-negotiables?
Yeah, but they diverge on some crucial issues, especially when it comes to property rights and how to deal with existing inequalities in society.
Okay, so it's not just a simple left-right divide like we see in politics.
Right, it's more nuanced than that. Left libertarians, for example, tend to be more skeptical of concentrated economic power.
So they're not just about letting the market run wild, they're also concerned about fairness.
Exactly. They're often concerned about making sure everyone has a fair shot, even if that means addressing some of the historical injustices that have led to inequality.
So they're acknowledging that the playing field might not be.
Right. They might argue that even if you acquire wealth through seemingly legitimate means like inheritance, the original source of that wealth might be tainted by things like colonialism or exploitation.
I see that as a whole other layer of complexity to the whole idea of property rights.
It does, and it leads to some really interesting debates within libertarianism.
Okay, so where do right libertarians stand on these issues?
They tend to be more accepting of existing economic inequalities. They see them as largely the result of individual choices and market forces.
So for them, it's more about sticking to those core principles of individual freedom and limited government, even if it leads to some level of inequality.
Yeah, they'd argue that trying to redistribute wealth is ultimately counterproductive and infringes on individual rights. They believe the free market, even if it's not perfect, is the most just way to allocate resources.
Okay, so two different perspectives, both rooted in those same core libertarian values, but with different implications for how we structure society.
Exactly, and it's a debate that's still going on today with valid points on both sides.
Well, it's definitely giving me a lot to think about, and we've only just scratched the surface here.
I know, right? And there's so much more to explore.
But before we get lost in the weeds of those debates, let's zoom in on a concept that seems to be fundamental to so much of libertarian thought: self-ownership.
Ah, yes, self-ownership. That's the bedrock of it all.
It sounds simple enough, but I have a feeling it's a lot more profound than it first appears.
You're absolutely right. It's the idea that each individual has the ultimate right to control their own body, their own labor, and the fruits of their labor. It's a powerful assertion of individual autonomy.
Okay, so if we truly own ourselves, what does that mean in practice? Does it mean we can do anything we want regardless of the consequences?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the matter. Self-ownership doesn't give you a free pass to harm others.
So it's not about being selfish or reckless?
No, it's about respecting everyone's self-ownership. It's about being free from coercion, but not having the right to coerce others.
Okay, so can you give us an example of how this plays out in real life?
Sure, think about something like assault or slavery. Those are clear violations of self-ownership because they involve using someone's body without their consent.
Right, that makes sense. You're taking away their control over themselves.
Exactly. On the other hand, things like consensual employment, even if there's a power imbalance, are considered okay because they're based on voluntary agreement.
So the key is consent. If someone freely chooses to participate, even if it involves risks or inequalities, that's okay.
Right. It's about respecting individual autonomy and making sure people aren't being forced into situations against their will.
Okay, that makes sense. But I imagine this idea also has some pretty big implications for other areas of society, like how we think about taxation.
Oh, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. Libertarians, especially those who really emphasize self-ownership, often argue that taxation is a form of forced labor.
Forced labor, how so?
Well, because they believe individuals own their labor, they see taking a portion of their earnings without explicit consent as basically forcing them to work for the state.
Wow, that's a pretty strong stance. I can see how that would be controversial.
It definitely is. It challenges a lot of conventional thinking about the role of government and the nature of individual rights.
This is where it gets really interesting. Philosophically speaking, we're talking about fundamental questions about how society should be organized.
Exactly. And it gets even deeper when we start to consider how self-ownership connects to another core libertarian principle, property rights.
Okay, so let's dive into that. I'm ready to peel back another layer of this philosophical onion.
All right, let's do it. Property rights are a whole other fascinating aspect of libertarianism. Property rights are huge in libertarianism. I mean, it's not just about owning stuff, it's about how we define justice freedom, the whole relationship between individuals and the state.
Okay, color me intrigued. Give me the libertarian take on property rights. What makes their approach so unique?
Well, libertarians look at distributive justice, fairness in terms of wealth and resources from a historical perspective.
Historical perspective. Okay, so what does that mean?
It means they're less concerned with achieving a specific outcome, like everyone having the same amount of wealth.
So it's not about equality of outcome.
Right. It's more about the process. How did people acquire what they have?
So a just society for libertarians isn't necessarily one with equal outcomes,
Yeah.
but one where everyone's rights were respected in how they got their property.
Exactly. They're focused on legitimate acquisition, and that happens in two main ways. Voluntary transfers, like buying, selling, gifting, and then there's original acquisition, which gets really philosophically tricky.
Original acquisition, you mean claiming ownership of something that didn't belong to anyone before. How does that even work without things descending into chaos?
That's the million-dollar question, and libertarians have been debating it for centuries. Probably the most famous explanation comes from John Locke and his labor theory of property.
John Locke, okay, so the guy who heavily influenced the American founding fathers, what did he have to say about property?
He argued that when you mix your labor with an unowned resource, you make it yours. Like if you cultivate a piece of unclaimed land, you build a house, you plant a garden, it becomes your property because you've transformed it with your effort.
So it's like you're putting a part of yourself into it through your work.
Exactly. Locke believed our labor is an extension of ourselves, and by mixing it with something in the world, we're kind of imbuing it with our own self-ownership.
Okay, I can see the logic there. We often value things more when we've put our own blood, sweat, and tears into them.
Right, but Any philosophical theory, Locke's has its critics and challenges. For one thing, what does it actually mean to mix your labor with something? It's kind of a metaphorical idea, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not exactly a precise scientific formula. If I pour a glass of tomato juice into the ocean, does that make me part owner of the sea?
And a good point.
Hmm.
Locke himself acknowledged limits to his theory. He argued that you can only claim what you can reasonably use and improve. You can't just fence off a huge chunk of wilderness and call it yours just because you touched it.
So there's this idea of proportionality. You can't claim ownership beyond what your labor actually justifies.
Exactly, and even if you catch a fish in the ocean, you've acquired ownership of that fish, not the entire ocean itself. Locke was writing at a time when there was still a lot of unclaimed land and resources, so his theory faces even more challenges in a world where things are more scarce.
Right. I could see how that would complicate things.
Yeah.
So if Locke's labor theory isn't perfect, are there other ways libertarians try to justify original acquisition?
There are a few other approaches. One is to focus on the practical consequences of property rights. The argument goes that a clear system of private property helps prevent the tragedy of the commons.
Ah, the tragedy of the commons, the classic example of the shared pasture where everyone grazes their sheep until there's nothing left.
Exactly. Individual self-interest leading to collective ruin, private property, incentivizes people to take care of what's theirs, leading to better productivity and resource management.
So in this view, property rights aren't just about abstract principles. They're also about creating a more prosperous and sustainable society.
Exactly. It's a more pragmatic argument focused on the benefits for everyone, but of course, there's a bit of a catch.
Oh, I bet there is. Libertarians are all about limiting the state's power, but don't you need some kind of enforcement mechanism to make property rights work? Otherwise, what's to stop people from just taking what they want?
You're absolutely right, and that's where the tension between libertarian ideals and the role of the state becomes really clear. A system of property rights does need a way to settle disputes, enforce contracts, and protect people's claims. But this is where philosophical anarchists step in.
Anarchists, wait, hold on. Are we talking about philosophy here, not Molotov cocktails?
Not quite those kinds of anarchists. Philosophical anarchism is a lot more nuanced than that.
Okay, so less about burning it all down, more about challenging the legitimacy of state power.
Exactly. They don't necessarily advocate for abolishing the state entirely, but they question whether we have a moral duty to obey laws just because they come from the state.
So they're pushing us to think about the basis of authority. Where does it really come from?
Precisely. And they explore alternative ways of organizing society, where things like justice and defense are handled without a centralized state.
So are they just dreamers, or do they have any concrete ideas about how a stateless society could actually function?
Oh, they've come up with a lot of ideas. They often point to historical examples of communities that successfully managed their affairs without a traditional state.
So they're looking to the past for inspiration as they try to imagine a different kind of future.
Exactly. They might talk about medieval Iceland, for example, where they had a system of private law and arbitration that worked for centuries without a central government. Or they might look at contemporary examples like the free software movement, which has created incredibly complex and valuable things through decentralized collaboration.
So they're showing that it's at least possible to achieve some level of order and cooperation without a top-down authority.
Right. It's about harnessing the power of individual initiative and voluntary cooperation. But even libertarians who aren't full-blown anarchists still want to limit the state's power as much as possible. They often advocate for a minimal state that focuses on just a few core functions like protecting individual rights, enforcing contracts, and providing basic defense.
The minimal state that seems to be the sweet spot for a lot of libertarians, finding that balance between freedom and the need for some basic level of social order.
You got it. And one of the most famous arguments for minimal state comes from Robert Nozick. He argued that even in a state of nature without any government, a minimal state could emerge organically without violating anyone's rights through a process he called the invisible hand.
The invisible hand, isn't that Adam Smith's idea about how the free market works?
Yeah, but Nozick applied the same logic to the emergence of a state. Imagine a world where people can form their own private protection agencies to defend their rights. Nozick said that over time, one agency would naturally become dominant because everyone would want to join the one that offered the best protection.
So it's like a free market for security competition drives agencies to provide better and more affordable services.
Precisely, and this dominant agency, according to Nozick, would essentially become a state, even though it arose without any central planning or coercion.
So the state, or at least something that looks a lot like a state, emerges from the free choices of individuals seeking to protect themselves. That's a very different origin story than we usually hear.
It is. It suggests that a limited state could be compatible with libertarian principles. But even Nozick's theory has sparked a lot of debate. Some anarchists see any monopoly on force as inherently bad, and others question whether such a minimalist state could really resist the temptation to expand its power over time.
Yeah, power does have a way of growing like a weed, doesn't it? You give it an inch and it takes a mile.
A very apt analogy. The whole debate over the role of the state is complex and fascinating. It brings us right back to those fundamental questions about freedom, justice, and the limits of power in any society.
Well, we've definitely covered some serious philosophical ground here, from Locke's labor theory of property to the ins and outs of anarchism and Nozick's invisible hand.
It's been quite a journey.
So where do we go from here? I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of libertarianism.
We've made a good start, but there's still so much more to explore.
Before we wrap things up, though,
Yeah.
we can't ignore the libertarian perspective on democracy, which seems like a bit of an odd pairing given their emphasis on individual liberty.
That's a great point. It's definitely a point of tension within libertarian thought and one that's worth exploring in detail.
Okay, so libertarianism and democracy, two ideas that don't always seem to go hand in hand. Let's see how they reconcile these potentially conflicting concepts.
Yeah, it does seem like kind of an odd couple, right? You have
Yeah.
libertarianism with its fierce individualism, and then democracy, which is all about collective decision-making. How do those two things even fit together? Well, it's definitely one of those areas where you see some real tension within libertarian thought, because while a lot of people equate democracy with freedom, libertarians tend to be pretty skeptical of it.
Okay, so what are some of the reasons they're not so keen on democracy?
One of the big issues for them is the whole problem of voter ignorance.
Voter ignorance.
Yeah, there's actually a good bit of research showing that a lot of voters just aren't very well informed about political issues or candidates or even how the government works.
Yeah, I've heard that argument before, and it is hard to deny that having an informed electorate is pretty important for a healthy democracy. But couldn't you say that even if individuals aren't experts on every policy, they're still the best judges of what's in their own self-interest?
That's a fair point, but libertarians who are into public choice theory would say that even well-intentioned politicians are still probably going to act in ways that benefit themselves or special interest groups rather than the general public.
So it's that old saying, power corrupts even in a democracy.
Pretty much, public choice theory says that politicians, like anyone else, respond to incentives. And in a democracy, those incentives often lead to policies that concentrate benefits on a small group while spreading the costs out over a much larger group.
So they might do things that seem popular in the short term, but end up having negative consequences down the road that voters might not fully understand.
Exactly. And that's why a lot of libertarians, even though they recognize that other systems have their own problems, they still tend to favor limited government with strong constitutional constraints on state power, regardless of whether that power is being wielded by a single person or a majority vote.
So they're basically saying that even in a democracy, individuals can still be subject to a form of tyranny. Not the tyranny of a dictator, but the tyranny of the majority.
Exactly. It's a more subtle kind of coercion where the will of the majority can override the rights of individuals or minorities. And that's why many libertarians put so much emphasis on individual rights and limiting the scope of government power.
Okay, I'm getting that. But even if libertarians are skeptical of democracy in practice, do they see any value in it at all? Or do they just completely reject it?
Some libertarians would argue that democracy, even with all its flaws, can serve as a check on the worst abuses of state power. The idea is that even if voters aren't perfectly informed, they're at least likely to notice and push back against policies that directly harm their own interests.
So it's less about seeing democracy as inherently good and more about seeing it as a potentially useful tool for limiting government overreach.
Exactly. It's a pragmatic approach. They may not love democracy, but they can see how it might help to keep those in power accountable to the people, at least to some degree.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job unpacking all this. We've explored the history of libertarianism. We've dug into its core principles like self-ownership and property rights. We've even wrestled with philosophical anarchism and questioned the nature of democracy.
It's been quite a deep dive, and what I find so fascinating about libertarianism is how it really forces you to examine your own beliefs about how society should be organized.
It definitely makes you think about the balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility, the limits of state power, and what justice really means.
And that's what's so great about engaging with these complex philosophies. It's not about finding all the answers. It's about expanding your thinking, challenging your assumptions, and getting a richer understanding of the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This deep dive has definitely done that. For me, we've explored the nuances, the tensions, and the thought-provoking arguments that make libertarianism such a compelling, even if controversial, philosophy. But now it's time to turn it over to our listener.
Absolutely.
We've given you a lot to chew on,
Yeah.
but the real exploration starts now as you grapple with these ideas and figure out where you stand on the big questions of freedom, responsibility, and the role of the state in a world where individual liberty is paramount. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into libertarianism.